Hi there, can you hear
Lovely
me?
to see you. Yes, loud and clear. Lovely.
Fantastic. All right, I'm gonna start my timer. All right.
Okay, now no worries. My talk is next, so you can eat up the time I ate from your talk, and I will compensate for it. So just thank you for being here, and I'm off the air.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you today. So thanks for the opportunity. I think that generally in organizations, we really pay a lot of attention to some of those very large core messages, the dominant narratives in our organization. And very often we can't see or can't hear the voices that provide alternative ways of us for thinking. And so I think that's really, really important. If we are thinking about change, we really do need to be thinking about what are all the voices, what are all the narratives. So as we start to, start today, I'm going to be thinking about why curiosity, why do we need to be aware of our narratives, and really why do we need to be brave. So from a curiosity perspective, we are innately kind of created to make sense of and create meaning in our lives about ourselves, our world, other people, how that all works, how to draw purpose and meaning and connection with other people. And so curiosity is a way for us to do that. Curiosity also allows us to see things from different perspectives, sometimes different from the main stories that we always hear. And then curiosity also allows us to position ourselves and other people in a position moving away from passive acceptance in the world that we live and the organizations that we work to one where we are empowered and we are critically engaging with all of the stories and all of those experiences. So Artem, I don't know, I'm not seeing the slides move forward. So in terms of narrative awareness, we live story lives. And so that's how we make sense of everything. And so it's really important for us to actually be aware of all of those narratives, not just the dominant narratives. Because while ignorance might be bliss, right, actually knowing what all the narratives are that exist really tells the story of the lived experience of your employees. And really kind of that knowledge is really important. It empowers people and it is an invitation to do something different. So think about the metaphor of taking a pebble and throwing it into a still lake. Once that pebble hits, you're going to watch those ripples emanate from the center outwards. That's exactly what being aware of your narratives in your organization do. It's about slow change. It's about bringing about adaptive conversations. And so clearly change can obviously be very difficult and emotional. It can be really fraught with all sorts of challenges within organizations because it's a human process. We're moving to something new. And generally change means that or meaningful change means that we are having to challenge the status quo. And there's usually consequences to that. That is never easy. And so as people who are working with stories or in narrative ways or who are storytellers, we need to be brave to actually share and invite people and to witness to the stories that exist in our organizations. And that takes bravery and courage. So Artem, I'm not sure if the PowerPoint is moving. It's not moving forward for me. So when we are thinking a little bit about...
Left corner. I will just jump off the air and cut it. So try left corner, buttons left and right.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm off.
Thanks, Artem. All right, so when we are thinking about narratives, there are some basic fundamental principles that we can all accept, right? We can accept that nothing is ever as it seems on the surface, that there's usually more to the stories that we generally hear, that there is usually more than one way of thinking about a particular situation, and those stories sometimes complement the dominant stories, and sometimes they stand in opposition or juxtaposition to the dominant stories. We can also accept from a narrative perspective that whether it's a dominant story or a hidden story, every story in your organization is valid because it's valid at some time to some people. However, just because a story or narrative might be valid does not make it optimal. And what we tend to find is that dominant narratives tend to be less optimal than some of the alternative hidden narratives that might actually show more of a case of what the lived experience of your employees actually are. So when we're talking about dominant narratives, let's think about those neon flashing signs, those communications that we're all bombarded with on a daily basis. These are, communications, narrative stories that are generally heavily manufactured. They're heavily controlled by whoever might, be leading the status quo, and they are defended against fiercely when you challenge them. These are really core messages. They're also the messages around things such as our core values and our principles, behavioral expectations. They're about the rules on how things get done. Today, we're seeing lots of really core narratives, dominant narratives across global organizations, such as inclusion and diversity, accessibility, sustainability, the importance of well-being and mental health. And each one of those are positioning the culture to position themselves that they're either working on those things or they're already really good at it. Now, when you ask employees about their actual lived experience, sometimes we find that the dominant narratives within those strands might not necessarily represent everybody. And so we know that there are hidden narratives. These are not as explicit. They're hidden actually in plain sight. We can find them by multiple things that I'm going to show you today, but particularly by looking for different narrative artifacts that might give clues or signals that maybe the dominant narrative is not quite as it seems or does not accurately represent the situation or people 100% of the time. Usually the hidden narratives tend to show alternate perspectives. So I'm actually going to use an actual example to show you how I did a piece of work. So I lead a client account management and feedback task force, and I was asked by a senior leader to design a feedback process, tool, or framework. And I'm going to show you how we went about doing that work. So from a traditional solutioning approach, it comes in from a leader. We can see it's generally very, very linear. There is an assumption that there is a perfect solution. There is assumption that solution will fix it and we'll never have to look at this again. And it also assumes that that the solution needs to be technical in nature. It's very, very linear. It doesn't generally include people other than maybe some SMEs, maybe some subject matter experts, maybe some leaders, but it generally doesn't include a wide range of people. The likely outcome for this, the solution, would have likely just been handing over some feedback framework, tool, or process. That's essentially how this traditional approach works. It's very limited, very focused. It's like taking a spotlight and saying, I need to solve a specific problem and I'm going to deliver on only that. Right? But we know we don't live in vacuums. So we use something such as a narrative strategy here, which I've put in a hot cross bun formulation. You can jump in at any point. So you can disrupt and discover how people react. You can do a whole set of research and discovery and figure out what that means and then test it out and disrupt. You can move around. The key points for a narrative strategy is it's co-creative in nature. It's very collaborative. You can see it's organic. You can start at any point. While it might be initiated by leaders, it's really owned and led by the group working on it. That includes end users. And it's really about discovering. It's about looking. It's about understanding. It's then about trying to make sense of, and then it is about delivering something. And notice that the key pieces around a narrative strategy is we're not saying we're going to deliver something at the end. We're saying that the strategy in and of itself is part of the intervention because you can start disrupting right away. So as we talk today, think about that pebble, throwing it in the lake and watch the ripple effect. So this is really, really kind of key to be thinking an organic strategy. It's you can pop in wherever you want, and it doesn't exclude the people who are going to be using the tools or framework. It also doesn't assume that there is a perfect solution. What it does assume is that when you get people together and elicit stories, you are going to find the lived experience, the narratives that really kind of impact what people want to do and how to enable them as you move forward. So there's a lot of narrative techniques that we worked on. I'm only going to talk about a couple today, but again, it's really about discovery. It's being curious and inquiring. It's then looking for these artifacts. It's about looking at a level of abstraction of coming up with themes that are representative of the stories, mapping them out so you can see the broad scope of things, and having adaptive conversations, which is just really inviting people to understand and make sense of the situation, of what might be going on for them. And so let's delve into the actual dominant narratives that came up. They came up in two broad categories: dominant narratives that related specific to feedback, and then some broader cultural narratives. So some of the dominant narratives for feedback were: we have a very healthy and positive culture of feedback. Feedback is a gift. You need to accept feedback gracefully. Do not get defensive, because feedback is always objective, it's always well-intended, and it is always useful. And feedback, the accountability lays with the person receiving feedback, not the person giving it. So we kind of take a look at those dominant narratives that have emerged through the piece of narrative work. And we, on the surface, they absolutely seem quite intuitive. There's nothing particularly alarming about them. When we start to look at broader cultural narratives, we found things such as leaders are always right, leaders are the experts, we don't want to question or challenge leaders, we're all in this together, like a one-team approach, the client is always right. And so you might start to get a sense that maybe there are other kind of factors that go in. But what we can say is certainly the broader cultural narratives support and maintain the initial kind of research around the feedback narratives. So I'm going to dive into some of the techniques now. So I held a range of, digital online co-creation narrative sessions where I used a set of design thinking methods as a way to really elicit and explore people's stories. So we looked at stories and experiences of good and bad leadership. We looked at how people might define and make sense of leadership experiences. We agreed and aligned on what some key practices and best practices would be, some fundamental principles. We looked at who gives feedback, who doesn't give feedback, what kind of feedback. We also ideated on possible solutions for the particular challenges and barriers that people actually identified by sharing their stories using these co-creation methods. We then took this and we did really kind of thematic analysis, which is really just uncovering and discovering patterns. This is a very, traditional kind of narrative approach to making sense of things. The value of this is that you can really delve in at the individual story level and then take a step back at a level of abstraction, start to make sense as a group. So we moved in, we did analysis for each of the activities. We then looked across all of the activities. Once we had all of those primary and secondary themes, we then mapped them onto a narrative map. Again, a very traditional way for us just to kind of look at the broad pieces of what might be out there. Now, a narrative map is really great, and the value of it is because it's now at a level of abstraction away from the individual stories and from the actual activities. These are now at the level of insights. These now allow us to make key decisions about what we can do about it. They also provide another view of insight. So just looking at the map, we can see that actually while there is acknowledgement and agreement that there is cultural resistance to feedback, which is a key insight, we can see that most people want to solve that with a technical solution. We know by daily practice and research that you can't solve cultural problems with technical solutions, right? We can also see some of the dominant narratives popping up around feedback is about performance and development, right? What we also noticed of interest was relationships came as a central part. Now, this feels quite intuitive, but when we did our research, it didn't really talk about relationships per se as being key. And yet people's experience and stories talked about how fundamental that was to, how they accepted or didn't accept their feedback. It further went on to show some sub-themes, for example, that people felt that there are lots of political or personal or power play agendas, and that intention wasn't always positive when receiving feedback. So we can kind of see from the narrative map and the broad narrative map with all the themes that actually, there are times where perhaps the dominant narrative does make sense and is representative, but there's clearly enough already for us to start to be critically thinking about, does that represent everybody all the time? And clearly we can see from the narrative map and the themes that it doesn't. So we start to look for artifacts through the work too. And artifacts are just think about yourself as an archaeologist. So you are on an expedition, you have a hypothesis that maybe there is a lost civilization in a particular geographic area. You are experienced, you know what you're looking for, you start to do your expedition. And that's all that narrative artifacts are looking for. We're looking for proof and evidence that maybe the dominant narrative is in fact true and accurate all the time, and maybe there might be examples or evidence that could suggest that it doesn't represent the reality of people's experiences. So for example, things that we could be looking at are language, for example, how people use language, their metaphors, right? We just heard about metaphors. It's about how we position ourselves or how we might be positioning other people, whose voices are heard and whose aren't. It's looking at power, it's looking at authority and all of those dynamics that really play into anything where there are relationships. It's looking at how people emotionally respond, and it's looking at relationships and how those change. And so when you look at these narrative artifacts as an archaeologist and you find them, you are pretty safe to know that, you can start to question the dominant narratives. So for example, linguistic features, basic example here. Here are some words that we found that people use in their stories, some clearly positive, right? This suggests that the dominant narrative might in fact be true, right? That we have a very healthy, positive culture of feedback. We also found evidence through people's stories and their language that it might not always be representative, right? It can be punishing, it can be punitive. It felt like personal attacks. It was unhelpful. It felt judging. Now, all of us can clearly say, now that we've extracted those from people's stories, whoa, hold on, maybe there is evidence that the dominant narrative might not be as strong as we think it is. We also want to be aware that just because something looks positive, for example, we have a whole long list here of very positive words, such as grace and gift. Now, these usually have positive associations, but when we take them back and place them back in the context of where and how they were used, we notice that the dominant narrative says things such as feedback is a gift, and that you need to accept it gracefully, and that you should not be defensive. So what we are essentially doing we are not only inviting, but we are positioning people in a way for them to passively accept anything and everything that gets said to them in the name of feedback. We can all agree probably today that that is not a great position, and that is certainly not a great place that you want to be putting out your feedback messages. So what looks positive on the surface, actually when you start to look at how it positions people and how that plays in power dynamics, it becomes somewhat more negative. And so we can kind of see that some of the dominant narratives, while they feel positive, they're actually positioning people to simply accept. They're taking away their power. They're disempowering them. People are becoming disengaged, right? So the question becomes, again, a hypothesis. We already have a feedback tool. Why do we need another one? It's not because the feedback tool isn't working. We're clearly finding evidence through the stories of the lived experiences that there's a lot of things that are going on. The other thing to notice is power, right? When you actually look at the relationships and the themes, it became very clear that nobody gave constructive feedback upwards to leaders. It was also very clear that clients are always right. That is a very dominant narrative. And how that relates to feedback is you receive feedback from your clients, you never give it to them. So we just want to be thinking about when you are looking for these artifacts, when you're looking for these dynamics, you can find them, and then you need to take them back to those original dominant narratives and say, does this fit, or what does it show us? So really kind of at the end, we're now at a level of abstraction away from people's stories where we're able to kind of say that, there's some clear challenges. We can all agree now based on the data, right, that there's clear cultural resistance to feedback. And that's quite nuanced. We can also say that people clearly are responding by trying to just get a technical solution out there rather than having adaptive conversations. We also identified that relationships need to be stronger and we need to enable people to do so. And then clearly the role of hierarchy, power, and positioning are really fundamental in an organization that considers leaders as the experts, that considers the hierarchy as king or queen. And so it's really important that you can see from the traditional method we would have just designed and handed off another feedback method. Here we are starting to really delve into the lived stories and how those expose the actual culture through hidden narratives. So some of the hidden narratives that we actually found are our culture of feedback is in fact driven by organizational politics, personal agendas, and positional power. We avoid constructive feedback to the point of reinforcing toxic positivity. When we ask for feedback, we are not asking for constructive feedback. We're asking for validation that we have done a good job. It is not safe to give feedback upwards to leaders. It is not appropriate for us to give feedback to our clients because the clients are always right. And feedback is often viewed as punitive, overly subjective, and rarely generally results in some form of loss. So let's just take a moment there. Those are the hidden narratives that have come out by using a narrative strategy and eliciting the stories of the lived experience of employees around their experience of feedback. That is very different to the dominant narratives that I shared earlier. Now, we simply accept dominant narratives because we assume they're accurate and correct all the time. And we can see that sometimes maybe they don't necessarily represent the whole truth. So part of the narrative, method is testing it out. And part of what I had done, again, this is not about testing it out the end. This is an organic process. As soon as I got the request and we started to think about and ideate on it, we went back to the leader sponsor and said, we feel that we want to do a much broader piece of work looking at, how we might enable people to do this differently rather than just handing over a framework, because we feel that there are some cultural challenges that we are facing. Right? As an immediate test, we got the go-ahead to do so, which was fantastic. But remember, it's a pebble and you're throwing it out to the lake and seeing where the land and where those ripples go. We then took it back to our broader task force and we wanted to validate that the narrative themes that we had found actually still resonated with people. So while we had moved away from the stories at a level of abstraction, we still wanted to make sure and test and validate that they still represented the very core of what we were trying to do. And then finally, we went to a much larger departmental meeting where we asked them three fundamental questions. What might enable you to give feedback upwards? What might enable you to give feedback to your client? And what might enable you to give two-way feedback? So these questions are curious, they're inquiring. Certainly, we are eliciting solutions from them, which we then collated, but they're also intervention because they're really putting out that there is a possibility that you can, in fact, give your leader some feedback. And you can, in fact, give your clients some feedback. And so again, it's the pebble and the ripples. And so the narrative solution, as you can see, is just far more nuanced. Had we done the traditional, the team would have just given a feedback framework, and that would have been it, right? We know because of what we found from the stories and how that means around the dominant narratives and the culture, that, you know, it might not have necessarily worked or worked initially, and we would just have to come back and give yet another technical solution. Our solution from our narrative work is far more nuanced. Yes, we gave a feedback framework. In fact, we simply referred the existing framework. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the framework that we have. In fact, it can be very, very powerful and intuitive. But what we did offer is a point of view. And that point of view was it's important for leaders to be open to receiving constructive feedback. It is important to have two-way feedback with our clients. And we need to acknowledge that our culture of feedback might not necessarily be as we say it is for everybody all of the time. So those are very powerful statements. Each one of them is a pebble that we threw out along the process. We also got leadership to kind of send out very clear messages about the importance, as well as obviously getting leaders to demonstrate that it is safe and to invite people to give them feedback. And certainly, you know, because we are looking at culture and we're looking at adaptive change, we wanted to provide enablement. And so certainly we provided top tip guides, again, all of those solutions that we elicited from people, as well as we provided a curated list of training resources specific to feedback, as well as a curated list of topics that are feedback related. So for example, how to build strong relationships, how to maintain relationships, how to manage conflict, how to have meaningful conversations. And so all of those things were things that we found by eliciting people's stories. So we feel, and we also asked people what would enable them to do this. So we're giving back to them in a very kind of structured, patterned way of the things that we know are going to lead to people wanting to do something different. We also need to be thinking about disrupting. And so disrupting really, again, is just that pebble. It's, you know, having those adaptive conversations, witnessing people's actual lived experiences. It's testing things out. And so I think that's really, really important for us to, you know, keep in mind. And then the process reflections, you know, anyone, I used to be a clinical psychologist, so I'm huge on reflection, but it's also part of a narrative process. And so when you are working with a smaller team, such as this task force, what happens in the team is usually a reflection of the much larger team. So how they might respond, how they might react. So the way that you're working with them and how they respond could actually give you lots of clues. It's an opportunity for to test your hypothesis or your solutions. It's a lot of opportunity to know how the broader system in which we all exist will actually respond. And so, for example, we found that as soon as the stories and themes started to emerge, that maybe there was a lot of negative intention in receiving feedback, and didn't all the stories or story narratives that didn't necessarily correspond with the positive dominant narratives, there was an immediate knee-jerk reaction. In fact, within the team, a narrative came up, a metaphor of the one bad apple. And this metaphor was a way for the team to really respond as a way to avoid and to dismiss and to defend against the dominant narrative, right? It's to defend the dominant narrative. It's easier to defend the status quo than it is to acknowledge that change is needed. We also focused on, you know, having conversations about, we seem to be focused on technical solutions, despite us all agreeing that seems to be some cultural challenges. We also had to stop and punctuate when we heard dominant narratives coming out in our very own conversations within the team as we did, you know, did the analysis, as we did the collaboration sessions. we also wanted to punctuate and notice and ideate and talk about the process itself around we're focusing on the positives. We want to run to a technical solution. We've done all of this work in eliciting these stories, and our knee-jerk reaction is to put those aside and just go for the easy route, which is to create a framework. And so the process reflection in itself is so important because it's the internal pebble throwing, but it's also a way for you to test out and understand how this might react as you, throw the pebbles out into the broader organization. So thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been interesting, and I hope I've stayed on time. Yes, 43 seconds left.
Bruce, thank you so much. That was awesome. I really was diving in so much that I was like, oh yeah, I have to go online back and chat. So guys, if you have questions for Bruce, please let me know and write them to the chat. I clearly saw one from Tatiana. Who are the stakeholders? Because this word can, include different people.
Yeah. So when we actually looked at the stakeholders, we actually got the people to talk about who are their stakeholders. So we are a very complex business, global, and while we are one team, for example, we support multiple parts of the business. So other stakeholders could have been learning partners, HR, business leaders, it could have been peers, it could have been your own leadership and management, your own teams. Our end users are us, right? I'm part of that whole group, and so we need to understand that feedback loop. Everyone that was in that group is part of the task force, but they are also part of the larger systems in which we do. And so it's exploring with people who are the characters, right?
Lovely. We have one more coming from Tatiana too. She says that's the part about stakeholders is now clear. So can you give us an example of a positive formulated question? How can it sound?
So instead of making a bold statement that leaders are not open to receiving constructive feedback, a positive, curious question, which is interventive in nature, is how might we enable leaders to, accept or find. So how might we enable leaders to do that, right? So I think it's about, you're still talking about something challenging, but you have posed it in a way that's interventive and gets people thinking.
Awesome. How might we is a clue to the design thinking. They use this phrase quite a lot, so that's a great clue. Polo is interested about the digital tool you are using for thematic analysis. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I use Mural, which is an online collaboration tool, and it allows for people to that you can invite and come in. You prepare your board, right? So there's obviously some preparation, or you could just do it all live and create. I find that when you are trying to elicit stories, it's best to have a structure and plan in place. That's as part of it, as the structure, so you can create your board, invite people in, and then it actually is live. So people come in, and you can time things, you can get people to vote and align on things. They basically move sticky notes, digital sticky notes, to kind of share their stories, to share their information. After that, obviously, you can move those around and create your themes. Yeah, so Mural.
Is it Mural?
It is, yeah.
Okay, I'll just spell it out to the chat. Awesome. Guys, if any more questions are there, please write them to Bruce. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask a classic now. You've heard it pretty much a lot by now. So culture forms the stories, and stories form the culture. What, in your opinion, came first, culture or stories?
Right. So I've been agonizing about this question because I thought, how technical can I go? So I would think it's not an either or situation. It's more likely a both and so if we're applying some basic systems thinking and narrative principles to this, we'd be applying the idea of feedback loops and circularity, so not thinking about things in terms of causality linearly, so the chicken or egg doesn't exist, they exist at the same time. And if we're thinking about storytelling is essentially a sense-making process, right? We are taking lots of information in, some will already exist in our stories, and, from a context culture perspective, that has a very strong downward contextual impact on how we think and make sense and behave. And similarly, the way that we think, make sense and behave has a implicative upward force on changing that very culture. Not as strong, but also we're not talking about origin stories. We're not talking about the beginning of humankind. The first person to ever create an organization might have been the chicken egg situation, but we all exist in a world of stories and we all exist in multiple systems. And so while it might take a human being to start an organization and maybe build their processes and policies from the way they think and the stories they know, or hire people that are similar to them, they're already coming as part of lots of generational historical systems and knowledge and stories. So they're not starting from an origin story. So I would say it's both and rather than either or.
Okay, you got even me confused. Thank you for that explanation. I like how it has a certain point where we can find the answer, but the point is long gone. But okay, for the sake of experiment, what would you say would that person answer who was in, the beginning of that moment where it all started coexisting?
An origin story, the person who did that would say that their stories created their culture.
Okay, I'll count that as an answer.
But we know that's not as simple as that.
Of course.
Because now no one has origin stories. We're all an accumulation of generational stories. So none of us are ever starting from scratch, even if we're starting a new company.
That is true. Yeah. I mean, pretty much it's not possible to answer this question in one way, I think. Thank you so much for your thoughts. And guys, let's give our fires to Bruce. It was really an awesome display of hidden and dominant narratives. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate your time. Thanks, Artem, and everybody else.